Major was a 19-year-old straight-A student with a bright future ahead of her.
She was like a younger mother, because she always kept me in the right track.
Clarence Jenkins was a 23-year-old construction worker who graduated from the School of Hard Knocks.
He wasn't book smart, but he was street smart.
Though it seemed their lives were headed in opposite directions, a chance encounter would spark a romance that couldn't be denied.
I didn't see what she saw in him. I look at it as opposite attract.
But their romance would quickly be spoiled by a gruesome discovery.
You could see what looked like a human hand.
Now, follow investigators as they piece together clues behind a horrific crime of murder and dismemberment.
I was like, are we seeing what we really are seeing?
And learn from those closest to the doomed couple what lengths they would go in the name of obsession and desire.
It's beyond belief to me that anybody could even dream up this scheme.
I never would have thought in a million years that my sister would be in a prison cell.
April 7th, 2008, Greenville, South Carolina. A local woman was returning to her apartment with her niece and nephew when she noticed something peculiar that made her stop in her tracks.
Greenville 911, your emergency.
I need to talk to someone. There's a bag on my door.
She noticed a black trash bag that wasn't there when she left that morning.
Okay, there's a bag on your door.
Out on the porch, but I don't know what's in it. And I got a threatening note.
The note said, you have to give me money by such and such date or bad things were going to happen.
Greenville police immediately sent a patrol car. And when they opened the bag, they discovered something even more disturbing than the threatening note.
I could see what looked like a human hand. We moved part of that bag and we saw severed toes. And then we saw what appeared to be a human foot just sitting in the bag. And I was like, are we seeing what we really are seeing?
The first thing was to identify that victim. Then your next thought is, how many more body parts are we gonna find?
Born in 1987, Carmen Major was a good girl, raised by a Christian mother in Greenville, South Carolina.
I adopted her when she was 3 days old. She's a fun-loving, caring, respectable young lady.
Carmen's mother took her faith seriously, and that meant for Carmen and her older brother, the church became like a second home.
She was an acolyte, she was an usher, she sung on the youth choir. She worked at Buncombe Street United Methodist Church as well. She would give you the shirt off her back or the shoes off her feet. She believed in helping.
A natural caretaker, Carmen also helped her mother keep an eye on her older brother, who was a lot wilder than she was.
She was like a younger mother, something like that you could say, because she always kept me in the right track, tried to, should I say.
Carmen worked hard to fulfill everyone's expectations. After graduation, she attended Spartanburg Methodist College. Being on her own for the first time, 18-year-old Carmen also took advantage of the opportunities college life provided, making new friends outside the church.
It was exciting because Carmen loved people and it didn't care who they were or what they were. She brought love to them.
Every time we went and saw her, she was enjoying herself. She always had good roommates and everything. So she seemed pretty pleased with it.
However, Carmen's carefree college experience would be cut short when in her sophomore year, she received some troubling news.
And her mother became sick.
I developed a staph infection in my body. I was bedridden for 6 weeks.
Carmen's family couldn't afford full-time nursing care, so she immediately decided to leave school and move back home to look after her mother.
She was taking care of me, taking to the doctor, taking me to, places that I need to go.
It was her duty, it was her obligation. She didn't hesitate to leave her studies to come home and take care of her family.
She just decided that mommy was more important. That's why she came home.
But as devoted as Carmen was to her mother, Being home again felt strange after getting a taste of what life could be like on her own.
She missed her school. I think she missed, her opportunities that were out there.
But all that changed when Carmen met 23-year-old Clarence Jenkins.
He was living in a neighboring apartment complex, and they began talking to each other.
She's stressed out, and she's lonely. And here's Clarence. He's flirtatious. He's putting attention on her. This is something she really needs.
Like Carmen, Clarence had also grown up in Greenville, South Carolina. But that's about the only thing his childhood had in common with Carmen's. Clarence's parents didn't provide much guidance at all. Ultimately, young Clarence learned most of what he knew from the other kids, committing petty thefts on the streets of Greenville.
He had some minor criminal records.
He was arrested on a bench warrant out of magistrate's court for a failure to appear.
With no one to guide him, young Clarence fell through the cracks. Instead of attending college or pursuing a career, he worked whatever temp jobs he could find in construction.
He would work sporadically, trying to make a living.
But there was one area in which Clarence showed a lot more ambition: women.
He was charming, and he knew it. And he was always able to use that charm to get the best-looking women.
And when Clarence met Carmen at their apartment complex, the first thing he noticed was her pretty face.
Carmen was a lovely young lady. She dressed well, and everybody loved her appearance.
Carmen was really cute, and that immediately caught his attention, so he didn't waste any time hitting on her.
Over the next few weeks, Clarence found excuses to keep bumping into Carmen around the apartment complex. And as he got to know her better, Clarence was struck by what a selfless caregiver she was.
This is a guy who grew up with no one to take care of him, and here's a woman who's built to take care of people. He was drawn to Carmen's goodness.
For Carmen, getting attention from a man as handsome and charming as Clarence made her feel special in a way she'd never experienced before. And as their flirtation continued, the sexual tension between them grew. Until one afternoon, Carmen and Clarence finally gave in to their passion.
It was most likely the first time that Carmen had had a sexual experience with any man.
After their first night together, Clarence decided to come clean and tell her about his run-ins with the law. To his surprise, Carmen was not only willing to overlook his checkered past, she wanted to help him overcome it.
Carmen was raised to see the best in people, and since this was her first real relationship, of course she wants to see the best in Clarence.
She invited him several times to come to church, and he came.
Carmen's mother, though, was suspicious of Clarence.
I didn't see what she saw in him. I guess being a mother, mothers doesn't see, but mother sees other things.
But an unexpected turn in their relationship would eventually give Clarence a chance to prove himself to Carmen's mother.
When she found out she was pregnant, he was decided he wanted Carmen to be his wife and to be the mother of his child, because he said Carmen was the best thing that ever happened for him.
Carmen said yes. And the young lovers were able to get married and move into a trailer just outside of town. Carmen was 19 and Clarence was 23. After the birth of their child, Clarence worked extra hours to pay the bills, while Carmen took a job at a sporting goods store. From the outside looking in, it looked like Carmen and Clarence Jenkins had built a happy and healthy household together. But events were about to unfold that would indicate life in their home was anything but pleasant. And hidden behind their walls was a dark secret. Coming up, investigators try to make sense of a terrifying murder, only to discover there may be more than one victim.
A similar plastic bag was left at a second location.
19-year-old Carmen Major thought she'd married the man she was destined to spend the rest of her life with when she met Clarence Jenkins, a reformed bad boy who was committed to turning her life around.
It was something that she saw in him that was interesting to her, whatever it may be, and it just drew him closer and closer.
But while the couple was settling down into their dream life, police in their hometown of Greenville, South Carolina, were dealing with one of the most gruesome crimes they'd ever encountered. On April 7th, 2008, officers responded to a report of a mysterious bag on a local woman's front doorstep. Inside, they made a horrifying discovery.
Lo and behold, it looks like a human hand and a human foot.
Didn't know if it was male or female, didn't know the identity of the person because all they had was a foot and a hand.
But the body parts weren't the only thing that had been left behind.
The second piece of evidence that they were able to retrieve was a threatening letter.
The letter was addressed to a woman named Grace.
The letter said, this is what will happen to Grace if she does not come back to the quote-unquote organization.
Grace was supposed to respond to the author of this note through an email address that they had left at the bottom of the note. The letter threatened her oldest son. He was going to be the next victim.
But who was Grace? The woman who found the bag outside her apartment said her name was Sue Bostic. Why then had the bag and note been left on her doorstep? And what was the organization? A cult of some kind? Or something worse?
We've got an organization that is killing people off and removing their body parts.
We're thinking, is this organized crime? You know, what is this?
Before investigators could begin answering those questions, they received more terrifying news.
We find out that there's a second location, a house, where a similar plastic bag was left.
Greenville 911, what is your emergency?
It's a black bag on the floor.
There is a black bag on the...
Yeah, it was a crime scene over here, you know, and the apartment, and they left a black bag over there, and it was body parts.
Yes, ma'am, I know.
Oh, my God.
Investigators rushed to the home, just a few miles away, and inside the bag, they found more severed limbs.
There was a severed human hand and foot.
They were both African American. We didn't know if they were the same hands and feet or from a different person.
The bag of body parts wasn't the only thing the two cases had in common.
There is another threatening letter. The notes were very similar, if not almost identical.
The new note was also addressed to someone named Grace.
It stated that basically this is what's going to happen if you don't return to our organization.
And with two identical crime scenes, detectives were now concerned they were looking at a potential serial killer.
Was this one victim? Was it two? How many people are dead?
Investigators knew their first two tasks were to identify the victim and figure out who Grace was. And while neither of the women who found the bags went by that name, they both knew someone named Grace.
The people who found these bags are both relatives of Grace. One is an aunt, one is her mother.
The woman from the first crime, Sue Bostic, was Grace Davis's aunt, while the woman who reported finding the second bag, Judon Burnside, was Grace Davis's mother. With their help, investigators located Grace's son at school and took him into protective custody. But finding Grace wasn't as easy. Neither her mother or aunt had heard from Grace in over a week. According to both women, Grace had fallen off the radar after recent problems with her estranged and abusive husband, Willie Davis.
The family painted a picture of a marriage that wasn't real good.
Their relationship was extremely volatile. He was abusive in the past.
According to her family, Grace struggled to afford a place for her and the kids after leaving Willie. Grace had taken him to court over child support payments, and apparently Willie hadn't been happy about it.
Willie Davis did not like having to financially support Grace Davis.
Willie had refused to pay. And with no job or income of her own, social services had determined Grace's children would be better off in the care of a foster family.
The Department of Social Services took Grace's children away from her.
Luckily, Grace's aunt, Sue Bostic, offered to take temporary custody of her children. But not long after Grace dropped the children off, her aunt said she suddenly disappeared.
They have no idea where Grace is. It's not like her not to be in touch with her family. They are really, really worried.
Police began to wonder, was Willie the one threatening Grace with the letters and bags of body parts? If so, whose severed limbs had been placed inside the bags? And what was the organization he referred to?
We're looking at him as a prime suspect because typically we see in domestic abuse cases where someone becomes emotionally angry of the separation and they become violent.
But before investigators could track Willie down, they got word that the medical examiner had been able to ID the dismembered body parts. It turned out that both sets of hands and feet belonged to the same person.
When they ran the latent prints from both hands, they came back to Nicole Harris.
Nicole was a 34-year-old resident of Greenville. When police contacted her family, they were devastated by the news. They didn't know who might want to hurt her. But they admitted that Nicole had been in and out of trouble her entire life.
Nicole Harris, who was kind of down on her luck, had some struggles with addiction.
Was an individual that didn't really have a stable home, sort of lived in various places.
But as far as Nicole's family knew, she had no connection to anyone named Grace Davis, which left investigators with a puzzling question.
Why is her body being used as a potential threat to Grace Davis?
Hoping to find out, investigators reset their sights on Grace's husband, Willie. But when they spoke with him, Willie told police he didn't know anyone named Nicole Harris.
He had no clue who could have wrote the letters, and he didn't know what Grace was involved in.
To prove his innocence, Willie gave police a detailed account of everywhere he'd been in the last 48 hours. And witnesses who'd seen him were able to verify his claims.
He had a very strong alibi of where he was at the time.
It was clear that Willie Davis was not involved in this particular murder.
Suddenly, investigators found themselves back at square one, and all they had was a list of unanswered questions. Where was Grace Davis? Who was after her? And what had been the fate of Nicole Harris?
We knew the hands and feet belonged to Nicole Harris, but, where was the rest of her?
The only thing police knew for sure was that if Grace Davis was still alive, she was in grave danger. Meanwhile, the people of Greenville, South Carolina were in a state of panic with a murderer lurking in their midst. Local residents like Clarence and Carmen Jenkins huddled with their children behind closed doors, hoping that police would catch the killers before they could strike again. Coming up, investigators race against the clock to find Grace before it's too late. And the search unexpectedly leads to a pair of surprising suspects.
After she left her husband, she ended up moving in with this couple.
In April of 2007, detectives in Greenville, South Carolina were in the midst of investigating a gruesome crime. Police had recovered 2 threatening letters addressed to a woman named Grace Davis, along with plastic bags containing body parts belonging to a missing 34-year-old named Nicole Harris. But so far, police were unable to find any link between the 2 women.
We were not able to find any connection between Grace Davis and her family and Nicole Harris. Why is her body being used as a potential threat of something that's going to happen to Grace Davis?
With Grace Davis unaccounted for, police weren't sure how they were going to answer that question. But after a week of exhaustive searching, police finally caught the break they were looking for. A tip led officers to the home of one of Grace Davis's close friends on the outskirts of Greenville. Officers knocked and were shocked when Grace Davis met them at the door. She was unharmed and unaware of the letters and bags that had been left at her aunt and mother's homes. When Grace learned about the threats made against her, she was visibly shaken.
She was nervous. She was scared about what was going on. She didn't know who Nicole Harris was. We showed her a picture of Nicole Harris. She didn't recognize that photograph.
Once again, it seemed detectives had reached a dead end. But they couldn't help but wonder, did Grace know more than she was telling them?
There's always more. It's just getting the facts the best you can and then going back over those and kind of squeezing more information out.
Investigators wanted to know, what had Grace been doing in the months since her family lost track of her? Grace explained that life had been difficult since she decided to leave her ex-husband, until a kind-hearted couple from a local church offered to take her in.
She had been living with this couple, Clarence and Carmen Jenkins.
Grace explained that in return for room and board, she helped Carmen around the house and looked after the 2 small children while their mother was at work. Then that fall, Clarence had fallen back to his former ways when he was arrested on an outstanding warrant and sent to jail for 90 days. During his absence, Grace said she and Carmen came to rely on one another.
They definitely had a lot in common with each other and really understood each other.
But Grace confessed that as the weeks passed, their feelings for one another grew far beyond simple friendship.
During that time period, Carmen and Grace became intimate.
Carmen and Grace fell in love with each other.
While Clarence was in jail, his wife and housemate had secretly become lovers. But Grace told them that once Clarence returned home, Carmen didn't try to hide their relationship. At first, Clarence was shocked. But then Grace explained he decided there were advantages to his wife being in love with another woman.
Clarence decided that they all 3 were going to be a unit. The relationship was among all 3. There was a sexual relationship between Carmen, Grace, and Clarence.
And for a while, Grace confessed their arrangement seemed adventurous and exciting.
It was a lot of drinking, different sexual acts being conducted among the 3 of them.
But Grace missed her own children and wanted them to come live with her again. At the time, they were still living with her aunt, and social services deemed her strange living situation with Carmen and Clarence as unacceptable. They informed Grace that to get permanent custody of her children, she would have to find a place of her own. It was an easy decision. Grace left the house and her relationship with Carmen and Clarence Jenkins behind.
She ultimately ended up moving out of this relationship to try to get her custody of her kids back.
Investigators wondered, how had Carmen and Clarence felt about Grace leaving them? Was it possible they'd been angry enough to send the threatening letters? Could their marriage be the organization they referred to? Grace didn't seem to think so.
She didn't think that Clarence and Carmen were mad because she left. When she left, everything was fine.
And when investigators did a little digging on the couple, they discovered that despite Clarence's recent stint in jail, he and Carmen hardly fit the profile of dangerous killers.
They belonged to a church in the heart of downtown Greenville. They were just some married couple with kids.
But if they weren't the ones threatening Grace, who was? How had Nicole Harris become involved? And where was her body?
Finding her body would paint the picture for what happened to her, because if you find the body, you can pretty much find out how she died.
With little else to go on, detectives turned their attention to locating Nicole's remains. They put out word for anyone who'd seen her in the days before she was dismembered. The move paid off.
A lady called in and told us that she knew Nicole.
The caller told investigators that she'd seen Nicole just a couple of days before. Nicole had been hanging out at a local temp agency, and she wasn't alone. Nicole was with one of the construction workers, 24-year-old Clarence Jenkins. According to the witness, Clarence and Nicole appeared to be more than casual acquaintances.
She saw Clarence Jenkins and Nicole Harris, and that Nicole Harris was sitting in his lap and saw them walk into the bathroom together.
It appeared that they had been intimate.
For investigators, the tip finally connected the dots between the victim Nicole Harris and Grace Davis. And that connection was Clarence Jenkins. It also appeared they didn't just have one complicated love triangle on their hands, but two.
We've got Grace Davis being involved in a menage a trois with Carmen and Clarence Jenkins. We've got Clarence Jenkins with some sort of relationship with Nicole Harris.
But the fact that Carmen and Clarence had relationships with both women didn't prove they were the ones sending the letters to Grace Davis, or that they were the ones who'd severed Nicole Harris's arms and legs. Before questioning Clarence, investigators needed more evidence. So they went back to the threatening letters and the way the organization had instructed Grace to contact them.
One of the most important pieces of evidence was an email address.
We started tracking IP addresses to see when and where that email had been accessed.
Police came up with an address where the email account was activated, the Greenville County Library. And when officers arrived to check the library's records, they finally got the break they'd been waiting for.
Greenville County Library has video, really good video. So we've got the video for those dates and times that the IP address was used for that email.
Carmen and Clarence Jenkins were checking the email address that had been provided on the note.
It links them to the body parts via the letters.
As shocking as it sounded, it appeared that Carmen and Clarence Jenkins were in fact the menacing organization who had murdered and dismembered Nicole Harris. But why?
The biggest question was why anyone would want to do this to Nicole Harris.
Coming up, police search the Jenkins home and turn up some disturbing evidence.
As soon as I went in the hallway, I observed what I thought was blood.
And investigators finally learn what really happened to Nicole Harris.
He handcuffed her to a chair in the living room.
To the outside world, Carmen and Clarence Jenkins were a loving and devoted married couple. But a criminal investigation had revealed surprising secrets about the Jenkins relationship.
Carmen had fallen in love with a woman named Grace Davis, and Clarence decided that they would be a threesome.
They really were in a three-way relationship, all living in that trailer.
But Grace had broken things off, and police now suspected that Carmen and Clarence severed the arms and legs from another woman named Nicole Harris and sent the limbs to Grace Davis as a threat.
The letters are basically saying you have to come back.
Police arrested Carmen and Clarence Jenkins on suspicion of murder on April 10th. Investigators began by questioning Carmen first. At that point, the only tie police knew about between Carmen and Nicole Harris was Clarence, who an eyewitness had seen with Nicole at a local business. So getting Carmen to talk was key, but Carmen surprised them with her cold reaction.
No emotion. She was very just plain-faced and just stare you in the eye. She didn't react to anything. We talked about Nicole Harris. She didn't know who Nicole Harris was. She requested her attorney. So at that point, we terminated the interview.
But across the hall, detectives found Clarence much more willing to talk. He confirmed that he and Carmen had at one time had a three-way romance with Grace Davis.
He played it off like it didn't bother him that she left. She left on her own.
It didn't seem like it was that big of a deal to him.
When police asked Clarence about Nicole Harris, he admitted he knew her, though not as well as Grace. According to Clarence, Nicole was merely a girl he'd met at a temp agency.
Clarence said he had seen her a couple of times, but denied ever having any contact with her, denied ever even speaking to her.
But police had already spoken with a witness who'd seen Clarence and Nicole making out at the temp agency, just days before her dismembered body parts had been discovered. Which meant Clarence Jenkins was lying, and left police wondering what else he might be hiding. To find out, police obtained a search warrant for Clarence and Carmen's trailer. What they found inside was disturbing, to say the least.
It was nasty. There was food on the counter, dirty dishes, bugs.
But the filth wasn't enough to hide evidence of possible foul play.
As soon as I went in the hallway, I observed what I thought was suspected blood.
Police found more blood inside the shower.
You could see blood spatter. Looks like somebody had actually been murdered inside of there.
Blood samples collected from the house came back with a match to Nicole Harris, which led prosecutors to file murder charges against the couple and hold them both in custody until trial. Investigators also found documents in Clarence and Carmen's trailer that shed some light on the couple's relationship with Grace Davis.
We found copies of drafts of these marriage vows, how they would all three be together and nothing could separate them.
The vows had been written by Clarence, and based on what he wrote, his feelings for Grace were far from casual.
These weren't just made-up wedding vows. Based on what he wrote, you would think that Grace was the love of his life.
To detectives, Clarence's devotion to Grace suggested that he might have been willing to do anything to get her back, including the seduction and murder of an innocent young woman. It also made detectives question if it was possible that Carmen might not have played a major role in the crime and was just covering up for her husband. So prosecutors approached Carmen's attorneys with a deal. If Carmen pled guilty and testified against Clarence, she would receive a reduced sentence with the possibility of parole.
Do you want to spend the rest of your life in prison, or do you want an opportunity to get out?
For over a year, Carmen stood by her husband and remained silent. Then in September of 2009, it seemed Carmen's conscience finally overcame her love for Clarence.
She had remorse. She decided that she wanted to do what she could to make things as right as she possibly could. She decided to cooperate.
Through her attorney, Carmen directed authorities to a field outside of town, where she said they would find the body of Nicole Harris. When investigators searched the area, they found Nicole's charred body stuffed into the remains of a folding baby crib.
We did have a little bit of closure. We were able to get the remains to Nicole's family.
But that was only part of what prosecutors wanted from Carmen. They also needed to know why the couple killed Nicole to threaten Grace. Carmen explained that the trouble had begun when Clarence came back from his 90 days in jail and discovered she and Grace had begun sleeping together. Carmen said Clarence was stunned and she was anticipating a fight. But to her surprise, Clarence said he wasn't angry. Instead, he was excited.
There tends to be a lot of jealousy in three-way relationships, but not so here. They both loved Grace, and they both loved her deeply.
Not wanting to upset or leave her husband, Carmen decided to give the three-way relationship a try. As long as it was just physical, she didn't see it as a problem. Grace felt the same way. And for the first few months, their threesome seemed to work out better than Carmen had expected. But that changed when Carmen noticed Clarence becoming more possessive and controlling toward her and Grace.
He wanted to control their movements and where they went and what they did.
He would force them to stay inside the trailer, with lockets so they couldn't leave.
But Clarence's demands hadn't been enough to keep Grace Davis from moving out when she got an opportunity to regain custody of her 2 children. Carmen told police that when Grace left, Clarence was furious. To him, it was more than just a breakup. It was a betrayal.
She decided to leave their little, threesome. That enraged him.
Clarence wants to show Grace this is what's going to happen to you if you don't comply.
To send his message, Clarence had told Carmen he needed a victim. And from what he knew of Nicole Harris's drug addiction and transient lifestyle, she, in Clarence's mind, was the perfect candidate.
He didn't think anybody would miss her or report her missing, an easy victim.
Carmen told detectives that she was horrified by what Clarence was planning and thought about leaving him, but was too afraid of what he might do.
For Carmen to stay with Clarence, she may had some feelings for him, but I wouldn't exactly say it was love. It was more or less like fear.
Then, on April 4th, Clarence put his plan into action. He approached Nicole at the temp agency and convinced her that he wasn't really a day laborer looking for work, but a drug enforcement officer working undercover.
Clarence Jenkins was able to convince Nicole Harris that he was actually a law enforcement officer. And he handcuffed her and said, "You're under arrest for drugs."
But instead of taking her to jail, Clarence took Nicole back to the trailer. There, she became his prisoner.
He handcuffed her to a chair in the living room.
Carmen told police she was terrified of what Clarence might do next. But then her husband made it clear that he wasn't going to do anything. She was.
Clarence told her to go in there and kill Nicole. Clarence gave her a piece of coaxial cable told her to strangle her to death.
Carmen said that with Clarence becoming increasingly unstable, she believed that if she refused, Clarence would turn on her. So Carmen told police that she was forced to do something she never imagined she was capable of.
Carmen went in, put the coaxial cable around her neck, tried to strangle her.
But in the end, Carmen just couldn't bring herself to go through with it.
Nicole was fighting, and Carmen couldn't do it.
Clarence wasn't going to let Carmen's failure ruin his plans, however. So he stepped in and finished the job.
Clarence put a bag over Nicole's head, wrapped the cord around her neck, and strangled her to death.
But killing Nicole was only the first step in Clarence's plan. Carmen told police he made her help him drag Nicole's body into the shower. He wanted to dismember her remains, but it ended up being more difficult than he imagined.
They tried sawing with the knife. They tried chopping with a machete. It was the pruning shears that gave them the ability to sever the hands and the feet.
Carmen said she spent the next day in a state of shock from the horror of what she'd helped her husband do. But Clarence's plan wasn't done. And after disposing of Nicole's body in a remote field, he forced Carmen to help him deliver the bags of Nicole's severed limbs to the doorsteps of Grace's relatives, along with the 2 threatening notes. Then, they waited for Grace to get the message.
Clarence makes Carmen go to the library every day to check the emails to see if they've gotten a response from Grace.
Carmen's confession gave investigators what they needed to charge Clarence Jenkins in the abduction and murder of Nicole Harris. But would her testimony alone be enough to convict her husband at trial? Coming up, state prosecutors assemble what they believe is an open and shut case against Clarence Jenkins.
It was extremely powerful evidence.
Until a courtroom bombshell threatens to turn the murder trial upside down.
Everything that Carmen Jenkins is telling you is a lie.
Carmen and Clarence Jenkins stood accused of the brutal murder and dismemberment of 34-year-old Nicole Harris. A crime that prosecutors said was part of a bizarre plot to convince the couple's former lover, Grace Davis, to rejoin their 3-way romance.
Nicole Harris was the victim of a senseless crime, and this was a cold, calculated, and callous murder.
It was devastating knowing my daughter. She would not do anything to hurt anybody.
With Carmen's confession in hand, prosecutors felt they had a solid case against Clarence. And in April of 2012, Clarence stood trial for Nicole's murder. Carmen was the prosecutor's star witness, having agreed to testify against her husband in exchange for a plea deal.
Carmen Jenkins was able to detail exactly how Nicole Harris was kidnapped, how she was murdered, how her hands and feet were severed. It was extremely powerful evidence.
Prosecutors also had DNA evidence collected from the couple's trailer.
The blood that was collected from the bathroom, from the wall, was blood of Nicole Harris.
Clarence appeared unfazed by both his wife's testimony and the evidence against him.
He didn't make any reaction when Carmen was detailing the gruesomeness of the murder.
And when the courtroom heard his defense, it soon became clear why. Defense attorneys conceded that the DNA evidence proved Nicole Harris had been killed inside the Jenkins trailer. But the evidence didn't prove who killed her. According to his defense team, Clarence Jenkins hadn't killed or dismembered Nicole Harris.
The defense said it was Carmen Jenkins who had actually murdered Nicole Harris. I didn't have anything to do with it. I helped dispose of the body. Everything that Carmen Jenkins is telling you is a lie.
According to the defense, it was Carmen who was devastated when Grace left, not Clarence. And she was the one who'd been willing to do anything to get Grace back.
Clarence was claiming that Carmen was the mastermind behind this murder.
But why would Carmen target Nicole Harris, a woman she didn't know personally, to be the victim in her gruesome extortion plot? One simple reason, according to the defense: jealousy.
Investigators believe that Clarence was having an affair with Nicole, so perhaps Carmen did too. So is it plausible that she killed Nicole to exact revenge on Clarence?
But who would the jury believe? On April 13th, 2012, the jury announced they'd reached a verdict.
Clarence Jenkins was found guilty of murder and kidnapping. The judge issued a sentence of life without parole.
As part of her plea deal, Carmen received a reduced sentence of 40 years in prison for her role in the murder.
I never would have thought in a million years that my sister, the one that wants to go to college for 4 years, had all her dreams and knew what she wanted out of life would be in a prison cell.
It will be a long wait, but for Carmen Jenkins and her family, the 40-year sentence offers the promise that one day she can perhaps return to her children.
Now, since she's in prison, she's living a better life away from him.
While Nicole's killers had been brought to justice, her terrifying case proved that every marriage has its secrets, and some are darker than anyone could ever imagine.
It's beyond belief to me that anybody's thought process could even dream up this scheme, but actually carry it out.
You really never truly know what's going on behind a closed door.
In the summer of 1982, Waco, Texas, was known more for its quiet neighborhoods and close-knit community than for violent crime. Positioned along the Brazos River and surrounded by open countryside, the city offered a slower pace of life than many of the state's larger metropolitan areas. For local teenagers, Lake Waco represented freedom during the long summer months. Families gathered there for picnics. Anglers lined the shoreline before sunrise, and young people met friends to swim, fish, or simply enjoy evenings away from the routines of school and work. Spiegelville Park, located on the western side of the lake, was one of those familiar gathering places. Its winding roads, wooded surroundings, and secluded campsites made it attractive for recreation. But those same characteristics also meant that once darkness settled over the area, large portions of the park became isolated and largely unobserved. On the night of July 13, 1982, that isolation would become a central factor in one of the most infamous criminal investigations in Texas history. The case that became known as the Lake Waco murders has endured in public memory for more than 4 decades. Not only because 3 young lives were taken in an extraordinarily brutal crime, but also because the investigation, prosecutions, and later legal debates continued to raise difficult questions about criminal justice, the reliability of testimony, and the standards by which guilt is determined. Although convictions were ultimately secured, discussions surrounding the evidence and certain forensic techniques have continued long after the trials concluded, ensuring that the case remains a subject of legal and historical examination rather than simply a closed chapter in Texas crime history. Before investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and journalists became involved, however, There were three ordinary teenagers whose futures ended abruptly. Kenneth Lamar Franks was 18 years old. Having recently graduated from high school, he was described by those who knew him as friendly, dependable, and hardworking. He held part-time jobs while planning for his future, reflecting the ordinary ambitions shared by many young adults entering adulthood. Friends remembered him as someone who took responsibility seriously, particularly in his relationship with his girlfriend, Jill Montgomery. Accounts from family members and acquaintances consistently portrayed Kenneth as protective and loyal, qualities that would later become central to descriptions of his final hours based on testimony presented during the investigation. Jill Montgomery was 17 years old. She was remembered by her family as energetic, cheerful, and full of plans for the future. Like many teenagers during the summer break, she looked forward to spending time with friends before returning to school. Those closest to her described a young woman with a vibrant personality who enjoyed dancing and socializing, while also thinking ahead to opportunities beyond high school. Her relationship with Kenneth represented a normal part of teenage life, built around shared plans and ordinary experiences rather than anything that would have attracted the attention of law enforcement. Raylene Liddell Rice, also 17, completed the trio. She was known as Jill's close friend and was remembered as quiet, respectful, and devoted to her family. Unlike the later legal proceedings that would surround the case, the lives of these three young people contained little controversy. According to the available information, none had criminal records or known involvement with drug activity or violent groups. Their decision to spend time near Lake Waco on the evening of July 13th reflected a routine summer outing rather than any unusual circumstance. That ordinary beginning would later become one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the case. There was no indication that they believed they were facing danger or entering a situation from which they would not return. At approximately the same time, another group was traveling around the Waco area. According to evidence later presented during the investigation, David Wayne Spence, Anthony Melendez, Gilbert Melendez, and Perry Surita had spent part of the day drinking beer and using marijuana before driving through the city. As the investigation would later establish, these four individuals became central figures in reconstructing the events of that night. David Wayne Spence was portrayed during court proceedings as the dominant personality within the group. Records referenced during the investigation described him as having a history of violent behavior and confrontations. Witnesses characterized him as someone who intimidated others and had previously displayed aggressive tendencies. These descriptions later formed part of the prosecution's broader argument regarding leadership and intent, although many aspects of the case would eventually become subjects of legal debate. Gilbert Melendez, Anthony Melendez's younger brother, was likewise identified by investigators as an active participant in the events that followed. Anthony Melendez himself would later occupy a unique position in the investigation. Rather than remaining solely a suspect, he eventually became one of the prosecution's most significant witnesses after agreeing to cooperate with authorities. His testimony would prove instrumental in reconstructing the sequence of events and identifying the alleged roles of the others. Perry Surita, a cousin of the Melendez brothers, also became involved in the investigation, though his precise role would remain disputed throughout the legal process. According to later court findings, his level of participation differed from that attributed to the other men, an issue that influenced the charges ultimately brought against him. As evening approached, the paths of these two groups crossed near Lake Waco. According to Anthony Melendez's later testimony, David Spence believed Jill Montgomery resembled a woman who had previously deceived one of his acquaintances during a drug-related transaction. The available evidence did not independently establish that this belief was accurate, and no evidence confirmed that Jill had any connection to such an incident. Nevertheless, prosecutors argued that this mistaken identification became one of the circumstances leading to the encounter. The groups began talking, and what initially appeared to be an ordinary conversation gradually evolved into an invitation to continue socializing elsewhere. According to testimony presented later, the suggestion was made that everyone should drive together to purchase more beer before returning to the lake. At that stage, nothing in the available evidence indicates that the three teenagers anticipated criminal intent. Their willingness to continue the evening reflected the casual social interactions that frequently occurred among young people gathered at recreational areas during summer nights. It is precisely this apparent normality that later investigators and commentators repeatedly emphasized when reviewing the timeline. Unlike cases involving prolonged disputes or known conflicts between victims and offenders, the Lake Waco case developed rapidly from a chance meeting between individuals who, according to the evidence, had not previously known one another. This distinction would shape the investigation from its earliest stages because detectives initially had no established relationship connecting the victims to those eventually accused. Looking back through court records and investigative summaries, historians have often observed that the opening hours of the case illustrate how unpredictable acts of violence can challenge traditional investigative methods. At the moment the two groups left the public areas of Lake Waco, there was no immediate witness capable of documenting what would follow. No surveillance cameras recording movements, and no technology capable of tracing vehicles in real time. The responsibility for reconstructing the events would eventually rest on physical evidence. Witness interviews, forensic examination, and the testimony of individuals who themselves had been present during the crime. Those elements would become the foundation of one of Texas's most closely scrutinized homicide investigations. An investigation that would eventually produce convictions, while also generating decades of continuing legal debate over the reliability of evidence, the weight of testimony, and the enduring challenge of separating established fact from contested interpretation. The ordinary summer evening had quietly given way to the opening chapter of a case that would leave lasting scars on families, investigators, and the Texas criminal justice system alike. As the evening progressed, investigators believe the two groups traveled away from the more populated portions of Lake Waco and toward the remote area of Spiegelville Park. This movement, reconstructed years later through witness testimony and investigative findings, became one of the most significant transitions in the entire case. Public recreational areas gradually gave way to narrow roads bordered by thick vegetation, creating an environment where visibility was limited and the likelihood of outside witnesses diminished considerably. Detectives later concluded that the location itself became an important factor in understanding both the commission of the crimes and the difficulty of the subsequent investigation. During the early 1980s, the park contained few of the security measures that would become common decades later. There were no surveillance cameras, no mobile phones capable of recording events, and no rapid digital communication that could immediately alert authorities if something appeared suspicious. Investigators examining the timeline emphasized that once the vehicles entered the secluded sections of the park, reconstructing what happened depended almost entirely on physical evidence and statements obtained long afterward. According to Anthony Melendez's later testimony, the atmosphere changed after the group arrived in the isolated area. He told investigators that what had initially appeared to be a casual social outing deteriorated into confrontation. His account became one of the central pieces of evidence presented during later court proceedings. According to that testimony, David Spence began making unwanted physical advances toward Jill Montgomery. Anthony stated that Jill rejected those advances and struck Spence. Kenneth Franks immediately intervened in defense of his girlfriend. Anthony further alleged that Gilbert Melendez responded by striking Kenneth, while David Spence produced a knife, fundamentally changing the balance of the situation. It is important to note that these details came primarily from testimony provided during the investigation and later presented in court. Because only members of the two groups were present in the secluded area, independent eyewitnesses were not available to confirm each individual action. Throughout the years that followed, this reliance on participant testimony would become one of the principal issues debated by legal commentators reviewing the case. Nevertheless, investigators accepted Anthony's cooperation as an opportunity to reconstruct events that otherwise would have remained almost entirely unknown. According to the investigative record, the 3 teenagers were then restrained. Authorities later documented that bindings and articles of clothing had been used to limit the victims' movements and to prevent them from calling for help. Detectives viewed these findings as evidence that the crimes involved a sustained period during which the victims were prevented from escaping. The physical condition of the crime scene would later support the conclusion that restraints had been used. Although precise details concerning the sequence of every action continued to rely heavily on testimony. Perry Surita later stated that he remained closer to the vehicle and did not directly participate in the assaults. His description of his own role differed significantly from the allegations directed at the others. This distinction eventually became important during the legal proceedings, where prosecutors evaluated the available evidence against each individual separately rather than treating every participant identically. Even so, investigators continued examining Perry's knowledge of the events, recognizing that establishing the actions of every person present would be essential for determining criminal responsibility. As detectives later reviewed the available evidence, they sought to establish not only what had happened, but also how decisions had evolved over the course of the evening. Cases involving multiple suspects often require investigators to distinguish between leadership, participation, and presence. Those distinctions frequently determine the criminal charges ultimately pursued. In the Lake Waco investigation, prosecutors argued that David Spence exercised the dominant role during the crimes, while the evidence was evaluated differently for the remaining individuals. Throughout the investigation, authorities carefully compared witness statements against physical findings whenever possible. Although modern forensic science provides investigators with sophisticated DNA analysis and digital reconstruction techniques, many of those resources either did not exist or were in their infancy during 1982. Detectives therefore relied upon traditional investigative methods, including repeated interviews, crime scene documentation, medical examinations, and comparison of individual accounts for consistency. This reality helps explain why testimony assumed such extraordinary importance in the prosecution's case. The investigation also illustrates a broader challenge frequently encountered in homicide cases, involving isolated locations. When very few people are present, determining the exact chronology can become exceptionally difficult. Investigators often construct timelines by combining separate categories of evidence, each of which possesses different strengths and limitations. Physical evidence may establish that particular events occurred, while testimony may suggest the order in which they unfolded. Courts must then determine how much weight should be given to each category. In later years, legal scholars examining the Lake Waco murders often cited the investigation as an example of the complex relationship between testimonial evidence and forensic findings. According to the investigative record, the assaults culminated in the deaths of Kenneth Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice. Medical examinations documented that all 3 victims suffered multiple fatal stab wounds. Investigators also concluded that the 2 female victims had been sexually assaulted before their deaths. These findings formed essential components of the prosecution's case because they were supported by forensic examination rather than relying solely upon witness testimony. Authorities also documented that the victims had been restrained, a finding consistent with the physical evidence recovered at the scene. Rather than emphasizing graphic details, prosecutors focused on demonstrating intent, control, and the sequence of criminal conduct as they prepared for trial. Following the killings, investigators concluded that efforts had been made to move the bodies within the park. According to the evidence presented, Kenneth's body was left near a tree, while the bodies of Jill and Raylene were located nearby after officers expanded their search of the area. Detectives interpreted these movements as attempts to delay discovery or complicate reconstruction of the crime scene. Whether every action reflected planning or impulsive decision-making remained a subject explored during later proceedings. But investigators agreed that the disposition of the bodies required careful documentation because it could provide insight into the offender's behavior after the killings. The crimes remained undiscovered until the following day, when individuals visiting the park found Kenneth's body and notified authorities. Law enforcement officers immediately secured the area, recognizing that the location represented an active homicide scene requiring systematic examination. As the search expanded, officers located the other two victims nearby. Experienced investigators later described the scene as one that demanded meticulous documentation, because every physical detail could potentially contribute to identifying those responsible. Photographs were taken, evidence was cataloged, and the surrounding terrain was examined for anything capable of establishing movements into or out of the secluded area. Yet despite those efforts, detectives initially faced a difficult reality. They possessed no immediate suspect, no independent eyewitnesses, and no straightforward explanation connecting the victims to any known offenders. At that stage, the investigation remained defined by uncertainty. Solving the case would depend upon patient detective work, repeated interviews, and eventually the cooperation of individuals who had themselves been present that night. That cooperation would transform the direction of the investigation, but it would also lay the foundation for the legal controversies that continued to surround the Lake Waco murders long after the verdicts had been delivered. The discovery of the crime scene marked the beginning of an investigation that quickly grew into one of the most demanding homicide cases ever handled in McLennan County. During the first hours after officers arrived at Spiegelville Park, detectives understood that preserving every possible piece of evidence would be essential. The isolated nature of the location presented both advantages and disadvantages. While fewer people had entered the area after the crimes, reducing the risk of contamination, the same isolation also meant there were very few witnesses who could help investigators reconstruct the previous night's events. Every tire impression, discarded object, footprint, and physical trace had to be carefully documented before weather, wildlife, or additional visitors altered the scene. Crime scene investigators photographed the area extensively and established a systematic search pattern. The three victims were found within the same general area, confirming that the crimes had occurred in close proximity rather than at multiple locations. Medical examiners documented that all three victims had suffered multiple stab wounds. Investigators also noted evidence indicating that the two female victims had been sexually assaulted. Before their deaths, the victims had been restrained using available materials, and articles of clothing had been used as gags. These findings suggested that the offenders had exercised control over the victims for a period of time before the fatal attacks occurred. Although many details remained unknown, detectives believed they were dealing with a coordinated criminal act involving more than one offender rather than a spontaneous confrontation between two individuals. Identifying the victims was completed relatively quickly because they had been reported missing. After failing to return home, families who had expected an ordinary summer evening suddenly found themselves confronted with devastating news. While the investigation immediately became a matter of public attention, law enforcement officials attempted to balance the community's demand for information with the need to protect the integrity of the case. Detectives released only limited details during the earliest stages, recognizing that undisclosed facts could later help verify confessions or evaluate the credibility of future witnesses. As news spread throughout Waco, concern rapidly turned into fear. Residents who had long considered Lake Waco a safe recreational area struggled to understand how such a violent crime could have occurred in a place so familiar to local families. Public confidence was shaken, and investigators faced increasing pressure to identify those responsible before additional violence occurred. The absence of immediate suspects complicated that task. Unlike investigations in which victims have known disputes or identifiable enemies, Detectives initially possessed no clear explanation linking the victims to any particular individual or group. The apparent randomness of the encounter made traditional investigative approaches more difficult. Officers began by reconstructing the victims' final known movements. Friends, relatives, coworkers, and acquaintances were interviewed in an effort to establish a complete timeline of July 13th. Detectives sought answers to fundamental questions. Who had seen the three teenagers last? Had anyone observed suspicious vehicles near the lake? Did the victims mention meeting anyone new? Every interview contributed another piece to the developing chronology, even when individual witnesses believed their information was insignificant. Investigators understood that complex homicide cases are often solved through the accumulation of many small observations rather than a single dramatic breakthrough. At the same time, forensic specialists analyzed the physical evidence recovered from the scene. During 1982, many modern forensic techniques were unavailable or still developing. DNA profiling had not yet become part of routine criminal investigations in the United States. Consequently, detectives relied heavily upon traditional methods, including blood analysis, fingerprint examination where possible, comparison of physical evidence, and detailed pathology reports. Medical examiners worked to determine not only the causes of death, but also whether the injuries could reveal anything about the sequence of events. Although the forensic findings established important facts concerning the victim's injuries and restraints, they could not independently identify every individual responsible. Detectives therefore continued searching for witnesses capable of connecting physical evidence to specific suspects. As days passed, investigators interviewed numerous individuals throughout the Waco area. Information arrived from many different sources, some useful and others ultimately unsubstantiated. Every reported sighting required evaluation. Every rumor had to be checked before being dismissed. This stage of the investigation reflected the painstaking nature of homicide work, where eliminating incorrect information can be almost as important as discovering accurate evidence. Detectives remained aware that public attention could generate false leads alongside genuine ones. Careful verification became essential. Gradually, investigators' attention focused on a group consisting of David Wayne Spence, Anthony Melendez, Gilbert Melendez, and Perry Surita. Exactly how detectives first concentrated on these individuals involved the broader accumulation of investigative work. But what transformed the direction of the case was the willingness of Anthony Melendez to cooperate with authorities. His decision fundamentally altered the investigation because, according to prosecutors, it provided the first detailed account from someone who claimed to have been present during the crimes. Anthony's interviews became lengthy and highly detailed. Investigators compared each statement against the available physical evidence, looking for consistencies as well as contradictions. According to later court proceedings, Anthony identified David Spence as the principal aggressor during the crimes and described Gilbert Melendez as an active participant. He also discussed Perry Surita's presence at the scene while maintaining that Perry did not directly participate in the killings. Because Anthony himself admitted being present, detectives approached his statements with caution. Cooperation from a participant in a crime often presents investigators with both an opportunity and a challenge. Such testimony may provide information unavailable from any other source, but it must also be evaluated carefully because the witness may have personal motives, including the possibility of seeking reduced criminal liability. Investigators therefore examined whether portions of Anthony's account corresponded with independently established facts. According to prosecutors, significant aspects of his narrative were consistent with the condition of the crime scene and the medical findings. These perceived consistencies strengthened investigators' confidence that his testimony could help establish a prosecutable case. Nevertheless, the reliance placed upon Anthony's statements would later become one of the most debated aspects of the entire investigation. Defense attorneys argued that testimony from an admitted participant required especially careful scrutiny. while prosecutors maintained that cooperation had enabled authorities to uncover the truth. This disagreement did not emerge only during the trial. It continued for years afterward as journalists, legal scholars, and innocence advocates revisited the evidence. Another important consideration involved Perry Surita's statements. According to the available information, Perry also cooperated with investigators. His account, together with Anthony's testimony, assisted detectives in reconstructing the chronology of the evening. However, prosecutors ultimately distinguished Perry's alleged role from those attributed to David Spence and Gilbert Melendez. This distinction later influenced charging decisions and reflected the investigators' effort to evaluate each individual's conduct separately rather than assuming identical responsibility for everyone present. As interviews continued, detectives assembled an increasingly detailed timeline beginning with the meeting near Lake Waco, continuing through the movement into Spiegelville Park, and ending with the discovery of the bodies the following day. Every stage required careful comparison between witness testimony and objective evidence. Where testimony aligned with physical findings, investigators believed their reconstruction became more reliable. Where uncertainty remained, detectives documented those limitations rather than treating every allegation as conclusively established. This disciplined approach reflected the fundamental principle that criminal investigations seek not only to identify suspects, but also to build evidence capable of surviving judicial examination. By the time prosecutors reviewed the case for formal charges, investigators believed they possessed sufficient evidence to move forward. Yet even as arrest decisions approached, experienced members of the investigative team recognized that the courtroom would present a different challenge. Gathering evidence is only the first step in a homicide investigation. Demonstrating guilt beyond a reasonable doubt requires presenting that evidence clearly, addressing weaknesses openly, and allowing the judicial process to test every significant claim through cross-examination and legal scrutiny. In the Lake Waco murders, the transition from investigation to prosecution would ultimately determine not only the fate of the accused, but also the legacy of a case that would remain the subject of legal and historical debate for decades to come. As investigators concluded that they had developed sufficient evidence to proceed, the focus of the Lake Waco murders case shifted from the crime scene to the courtroom. This transition represented more than a procedural milestone. It marked the point at which months of investigative work would be subjected to the scrutiny of the American criminal justice system, where every witness, every piece of physical evidence, and every investigative decision could be challenged before a judge and jury. Prosecutors faced the difficult task of presenting a coherent narrative based on a combination of forensic findings and testimony, while defense attorneys prepared to question both the reliability of the evidence and the credibility of those who had chosen to cooperate with authorities. Formal charges reflected the different roles that investigators believed each individual had played. David Wayne Spence was identified by the prosecution as the central figure in the crimes. According to the state's theory, he exercised leadership throughout the events and bore primary responsibility for the murders. Gilbert Melendez was also charged based on investigators' conclusion that he had actively participated in the offenses. Anthony Melendez occupied a markedly different position. Having agreed to cooperate with investigators, he became one of the prosecution's principal witnesses. His testimony provided the chronological framework that prosecutors intended to present to the jury. Perry Surita, whose role had been evaluated separately throughout the investigation, ultimately was not convicted of murder because prosecutors and the courts distinguished his alleged conduct from that of the others. As pretrial proceedings began, attorneys on both sides examined the enormous volume of investigative material collected over many months. Police reports, crime scene photographs, forensic analyses, interview transcripts, and medical findings were carefully reviewed. Prosecutors sought to demonstrate that the physical evidence supported Anthony Melendez's account of what had occurred, arguing that his testimony explained facts already established by investigators rather than inventing them. Defense attorneys, however, approached the evidence from a different perspective. They emphasized that Anthony had himself admitted being present during the crimes and therefore possessed a personal interest in cooperating with authorities. They argued that any testimony provided under such circumstances required especially careful evaluation because it could potentially be influenced by the prospect of receiving more favorable treatment from prosecutors. This disagreement over witness credibility became one of the defining issues of the case. During the trial, jurors heard testimony from investigators who described their examination of the crime scene and the evidence recovered at Spiegelville Park. Medical experts explained the conclusions reached during the autopsies, including the causes of death and findings that indicated the two female victims had been sexually assaulted before they were killed. These forensic conclusions established important elements of the prosecution's case independently of witness testimony. They confirmed that the victims had been subjected to violent attacks and that multiple offenders could have been involved. However, forensic evidence alone could not identify the individuals responsible. For that reason, testimony from those connected to the events remained indispensable. Anthony Melendez took the witness stand and recounted the sequence of events as he had previously described during police interviews. According to his testimony, the encounter at Lake Waco began without obvious signs of violence before rapidly escalating after David Spence allegedly made unwanted advances toward Jill Montgomery. Anthony stated that Kenneth Franks attempted to intervene, after which the situation changed dramatically when Spence produced a knife. He described the movement into the isolated area of Spiegelville Park, the restraint of the victims, and the subsequent crimes. Throughout his testimony, prosecutors sought to demonstrate consistency between Anthony's statements and the physical evidence documented during the investigation. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, cross-examined him extensively. They questioned his motives, highlighted his own admitted involvement, and challenged aspects of his recollection. Such cross-examination reflected one of the central safeguards of the judicial process. Rather than accepting testimony at face value, the adversarial system requires that witnesses withstand detailed questioning designed to expose inconsistencies, omissions, or possible bias. Jurors therefore had the responsibility of evaluating not only what Anthony said, but also how credible they believed his testimony to be after hearing challenges from both sides. Prosecutors also relied upon additional witnesses and documentary evidence to strengthen their case. Investigators explained how the crime scene had been processed, why particular conclusions had been reached, and how witness statements compared with physical findings. The prosecution argued that when considered together, the evidence formed a consistent narrative pointing toward the defendant's guilt. Defense attorneys maintained that significant questions remained unanswered and urged jurors to exercise caution before relying too heavily upon testimony from cooperating participants. The distinction between established physical evidence and testimonial reconstruction became increasingly important as the proceedings continued. Physical findings could demonstrate that crimes had occurred, but testimony often supplied the explanation for how and why those events unfolded. The jury therefore had to determine whether the available testimony was sufficiently reliable to establish criminal responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. This challenge illustrates a broader principle within criminal law. In many complex homicide cases, no single piece of evidence resolves every question. Instead, courts evaluate the combined weight of forensic findings, witness statements, investigative procedures, and logical inference. The Lake Waco murders exemplified the process. Neither the prosecution nor the defense relied upon one decisive fact alone. Rather, each side attempted to persuade jurors that the overall picture either established guilt or left reasonable doubt unresolved. Ultimately, the trials produced significant convictions. David Wayne Spence was found guilty and sentenced to death. Gilbert Melendez received a sentence of life imprisonment. Anthony Melendez received reduced punishment as a result of his cooperation with authorities. While Perry Surita was not convicted of murder because the courts determined that the available evidence did not establish the same level of direct participation attributed to the others. For the families of Kenneth Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice, the verdicts represented an important stage in the pursuit of justice. Yet even as the legal process reached its immediate conclusions, the case itself was far from finished. Over the following years, appeals, independent reviews, and renewed public interest continued to revisit the evidence presented during the trials. Some legal observers argued that the convictions demonstrated the effectiveness of investigators who had solved an exceptionally difficult case despite the absence of eyewitnesses outside the participants themselves. Others questioned whether certain aspects of the prosecution had relied too heavily upon testimony from cooperating witnesses whose incentives could not be ignored. Additional debate later emerged concerning forensic methods that had been accepted during the original proceedings, but whose scientific reliability would become increasingly controversial in subsequent decades. These discussions did not erase the convictions, but they ensured that the Lake Waco murders remained more than a historical homicide investigation. Instead, the case evolved into an example frequently cited in conversations about the strengths and limitations of criminal investigations, the evaluation of cooperating witnesses, and the continuing development of forensic science. By the time the courtroom proceedings concluded, the judicial system had delivered its verdicts. Yet the broader questions raised by the case about evidence certainty and the pursuit of justice would continue to be examined long after the sentences had been imposed, ensuring that the legal legacy of the Lake Waco murders extended well beyond the original trials themselves. The conclusion of the criminal trials did not bring an end to public discussion surrounding the Lake Waco murders. In many homicide cases, a conviction marks the final chapter in the public narrative, allowing attention to gradually shift elsewhere as appeals move through the courts with relatively little public interest. The Lake Waco case followed a different path. While the jury had reached its verdicts and sentences had been imposed, questions about the investigation, the evidence, and the broader administration of justice continued to attract attention from attorneys, journalists, researchers, and advocates for many years afterward. As a result, the case became significant not only because of the tragic deaths of 3 young people, but also because it illustrated how difficult criminal investigations can continue to shape legal debate long after the courtroom proceedings have concluded. David Wayne Spence remained the central figure in those discussions. Following his conviction and death sentence, his legal team pursued the appellate process available under Texas law. Like every defendant sentenced to death, his case received extensive judicial review. Appellate courts examined issues raised by the defense regarding the conduct of the trial and the evidence presented to the jury. These proceedings reflected the safeguards built into the American legal system, particularly in capital cases where the consequences of error are irreversible. Although various legal arguments were considered, the conviction and sentence ultimately remained in place. In 1997, David Spence was executed by the state of Texas, formally concluding the criminal proceedings against him. Even after the execution, however, public discussion surrounding the evidence did not disappear. Gilbert Melendez, who received a life sentence, remained incarcerated. Anthony Melendez, whose cooperation had played a crucial role in the prosecution's case, continued to occupy a complicated position in public perception. On one hand, prosecutors viewed his testimony as essential in reconstructing events that otherwise might never have been fully understood. On the other hand, critics questioned whether testimony provided by an admitted participant should ever become the foundation of a prosecution without stronger independent corroboration. This tension between necessity and reliability became one of the most frequently discussed aspects of the entire case. Criminal justice scholars have long recognized that cooperating witnesses can provide invaluable information, particularly in crimes committed away from public view. At the same time, such witnesses may possess personal incentives that require careful scrutiny. The Lake Waco investigation became one example cited in broader discussions about how courts should evaluate testimony from individuals who receive reduced charges or other benefits in exchange for cooperation. The debate was not unique to Texas, nor was it limited to this particular case. Across the United States, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges have continued to confront similar questions whenever a key witness is also implicated in the crime under investigation. Another important issue that emerged in later years involved forensic science. During the original prosecution, bite mark evidence was introduced as part of the broader evidentiary record. At the time, this type of forensic comparison was accepted in many American courts and had been used in numerous criminal prosecutions. As forensic science developed over the following decades, however, growing numbers of researchers questioned the scientific reliability of bite mark identification. Independent scientific reviews concluded that the technique lacked the level of validation expected of modern forensic disciplines, and that conclusions based solely upon bite mark comparisons should be treated with caution. Consequently, commentators revisiting the Lake Waco case frequently pointed to this development as an example of how scientific standards evolve over time. Importantly, criticism of a particular forensic method does not automatically determine whether a conviction was correct or incorrect. Instead, it raises broader questions about the weight that should be assigned to different categories of evidence. In the Lake Waco case, prosecutors had relied upon multiple forms of proof, including witness testimony, physical findings, and medical examinations. Critics argued that some aspects of the case deserved renewed examination in light of advances in forensic science, while others maintained that the overall body of evidence remained sufficient to support the jury's conclusions. These differing perspectives illustrate one of the continuing challenges faced by legal systems worldwide. Justice depends not only upon reaching verdicts but also upon maintaining confidence that those verdicts rest upon reliable evidence evaluated according to the best scientific knowledge available. Another source of continuing discussion involved reports that certain witness statements had changed over time or were later challenged. Such developments are not uncommon in complex criminal cases that remain the subject of public attention for many years. Memory can change. Individuals may later reconsider earlier testimony, and independent investigators often revisit evidence with fresh questions. Journalists examining the Lake Waco murders interviewed participants, reviewed court records, and explored whether aspects of the prosecution deserved renewed scrutiny. These efforts did not produce sufficient evidence to overturn the convictions, but they contributed to the continuing debate over the case's historical and legal significance. The name of serial killer Henry Lee Lucas also entered public discussion during later years. Lucas confessed to hundreds of crimes across the United States, although subsequent investigations demonstrated that many of those confessions were demonstrably false. At various points, speculation emerged suggesting that Lucas might somehow have been connected to the Lake Waco murders. Investigators examined those claims, as they did many others involving Lucas during that period. Ultimately, no evidence strong enough to alter the official conclusions of the case was established. As a result, the convictions remained unchanged despite the continuing speculation. The fact that alternative theories were considered illustrates another important feature of major homicide investigations. Responsible investigators are obligated to examine credible leads even when they appear inconsistent with existing conclusions. Doing so strengthens rather than weakens the integrity of the investigative process because it demonstrates a willingness to test competing explanations against available evidence. Beyond the courtroom and legal debates, the lasting impact of the Lake Waco murders is perhaps best understood through the lives permanently altered by the crime. For the families of Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice, no judicial decision could restore what had been lost. Court proceedings may determine criminal responsibility, but they cannot return opportunities, relationships, or futures that ended in a single night. The victims have remained at the center of memorials, news retrospectives, and historical discussions precisely because the case serves as a reminder that every criminal investigation begins with individuals whose lives extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Kenneth was remembered as a young man beginning adulthood, known for his loyalty and determination. Jill was remembered for her enthusiasm and optimism about the future. Raylene was remembered as a devoted friend and family member whose quiet character left a lasting impression on those who knew her. These personal memories stand in contrast to the legal documents and courtroom records that dominate much of the public discussion. They remind historians and researchers that criminal cases should never become merely collections of evidence or legal arguments detached from the people at their center. Today, the Lake Waco murders continue to appear in books, documentaries, and academic discussions concerning criminal investigations and forensic evidence. The case is frequently cited as an example of two realities existing simultaneously. First, it demonstrates the extraordinary dedication required of investigators confronting a complex homicide with limited initial leads. Second, it illustrates why the legal system must remain open to continued examination of evidence as scientific understanding evolves. Those two principles are not contradictory. Rather, they reflect the shared objective of every justice system: to identify those responsible for serious crimes while ensuring that conclusions remain grounded in reliable evidence and fair legal process. More than 4 decades after the events at Spiegelville Park, the Lake Waco murders remain one of the most closely studied criminal cases in Texas history. They are remembered not only because of the violence that occurred on a summer night in 1982, but because they continue to raise enduring questions about investigation, prosecution, forensic science, and the difficult pursuit of certainty in the administration of justice. Above all, the legacy of the case belongs to the 3 young victims whose ordinary evening never reached its expected end, and whose memories continue to shape the historical record far more powerfully than the notoriety of those convicted in connection with their deaths. More than 4 decades have passed since the events at Spiegelville Park. Yet the Lake Waco murders continue to occupy a unique place in discussions of criminal justice in Texas. Unlike cases remembered solely for the crimes themselves, this investigation has become equally associated with the legal and evidentiary questions that followed. Historians, legal scholars, investigative journalists, and forensic experts have repeatedly returned to the case, not because its outcome changed, but because it illustrates how the pursuit of justice does not necessarily end when a verdict is delivered. Criminal investigations are products of the scientific knowledge, investigative practices, and legal standards available at the time they occur. As those standards evolve, older cases are often re-examined, providing opportunities to evaluate both the strengths and limitations of earlier methods. The Lake Waco case stands as one such example, reminding observers that confidence in the justice system depends not only upon reaching conclusions, but also upon maintaining a willingness to question how those conclusions were reached. One of the most enduring lessons concerns the role of testimony in complex investigations. In cases involving isolated crime scenes and few surviving witnesses, investigators frequently depend upon statements from individuals who were themselves involved in the events under examination. Such testimony can prove indispensable because it may provide information unavailable from any other source. At the same time, courts recognize that these witnesses may possess incentives that require careful evaluation. The prosecution of the Lake Waco murders relied significantly upon the testimony of Anthony Melendez. After he agreed to cooperate with authorities, prosecutors argued that his account helped explain physical evidence already documented by investigators and allowed the jury to understand the sequence of events. Defense attorneys responded by emphasizing that any witness facing criminal liability may have personal reasons to cooperate with the government. The adversarial process required jurors to weigh those competing arguments carefully. whether one views the outcome as an example of effective prosecution or as a case inviting continued scrutiny. The proceedings demonstrate the importance of allowing evidence to be tested openly through cross-examination rather than accepted without challenge. The case also illustrates the continuing evolution of forensic science. During the early 1980s, investigators employed techniques considered acceptable under contemporary professional standards. Over subsequent decades, however, scientific research led to more rigorous evaluation of numerous forensic disciplines. Among the methods later criticized was bite mark comparison, which had once been presented in courts across the United States as persuasive evidence, but gradually lost scientific support as researchers questioned its reliability. This broader development influenced discussion of the Lake Waco murders because bite mark evidence formed part of the overall evidentiary record presented during the prosecution. Importantly, modern criticism of a forensic technique does not by itself establish whether a particular verdict was correct or incorrect. Instead, it highlights the necessity of evaluating every category of evidence according to current scientific understanding. The willingness of forensic science to revise its own conclusions reflects one of the defining characteristics of scientific inquiry. Knowledge advances through continuous testing, verification, and refinement rather than through unquestioned acceptance of past assumptions. Another aspect of the case that continues to attract attention involves the distinction between historical certainty and legal certainty. Courts are tasked with determining whether guilt has been established beyond a reasonable doubt, according to the evidence presented during trial. Historians and researchers, by contrast, often revisit cases years later with different objectives. They examine archival records, compare investigative methods across different eras, and consider how subsequent developments in law and science might influence interpretation. These two approaches are related but not identical. A criminal conviction represents the conclusion of a judicial proceeding, whereas historical analysis remains an ongoing process capable of incorporating new perspectives without necessarily altering the legal outcome. The Lake Waco murders have therefore become part of a broader conversation about how societies remember significant criminal cases while acknowledging both the authority of court decisions and the value of continued scholarly examination. The speculation surrounding Henry Lee Lucas further illustrates the challenges investigators face when high-profile offenders become associated with multiple unsolved crimes. Lucas confessed to hundreds of killings, generating enormous public attention before many of those confessions were later discredited. Because of his notoriety, his name became linked to numerous investigations across the United States, including the Lake Waco murders. Authorities examined whether any credible evidence supported such claims, recognizing their obligation to investigate plausible alternatives. Ultimately, no evidence sufficient to overturn the established conclusions of the case emerged. This episode demonstrates the importance of distinguishing between speculation and verifiable evidence. Public interest in notorious offenders can easily generate theories that attract attention, but responsible investigations require every claim to be measured against objective facts rather than assumption or reputation. Beyond the legal debates, however, the enduring significance of the Lake Waco murders rests with the three young people whose lives were permanently interrupted. Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice are remembered not because they sought public attention, but because an ordinary summer evening ended in tragedy. Their stories remind us that criminal justice exists primarily to serve victims, families, and communities affected by violence. Court proceedings, forensic analysis, appellate litigation, and academic debate all occupy important places within the justice system, yet they should never overshadow the individuals whose lives gave rise to those processes. Every anniversary of the case serves as an opportunity to remember not only the investigation but also the aspirations that were never realized. Kenneth had only recently entered adulthood and was beginning to build his future. Jill was looking ahead to new opportunities beyond high school. Raylene remained closely connected to her family and friends, sharing the ordinary hopes common to teenagers preparing for the next stage of life. Those futures were lost in a single night, leaving families to navigate decades of grief while the legal system continued its work. Their experiences also influenced the wider Waco community. Crimes of this nature often produce effects extending well beyond the immediate victims. Residents reconsider personal safety, public spaces acquire new emotional significance, and communities confront difficult questions about trust and security. Spiegelville Park, once remembered primarily as a place for recreation, became permanently associated with one of Texas's most discussed homicide investigations, even as the physical landscape remained largely unchanged. Its place in public memory was transformed. For law enforcement professionals, the case reinforced the importance of meticulous crime scene preservation, comprehensive interviewing, and careful documentation. For attorneys, it underscored the necessity of testing evidence through rigorous judicial procedures. For forensic scientists, it became part of a larger body of cases demonstrating why scientific methods must remain open to continual validation. For historians and journalists, it offered an opportunity to examine how criminal cases evolve over time as new questions emerge without necessarily producing new answers. These different perspectives do not compete with one another. Instead, they collectively illustrate the complexity of administering justice in cases where evidence, memory, and scientific knowledge intersect. Today, the Lake Waco murders remain one of the most frequently referenced homicide cases in the history of Texas because they encompass far more than a single criminal investigation. They represent a convergence of tragedy, legal process, forensic development, and historical reflection. The convictions reached by the courts remain part of the official record, while continued discussion among scholars and legal observers reflects the justice system's ongoing commitment to examining evidence critically. This combination of legal finality and historical inquiry has ensured that the case continues to be studied by those interested in criminal investigations and the evolution of forensic practice. In the end, perhaps the most meaningful lesson is not found in any individual piece of evidence or legal argument, but in the recognition that justice is both a destination and a continuing responsibility. Investigators must pursue facts wherever they lead. Prosecutors must present evidence fairly. Defense attorneys must challenge that evidence vigorously. Courts must apply the law impartially. Researchers must continue evaluating historical cases with intellectual honesty, acknowledging both established facts and unresolved questions. Through each of these responsibilities, society seeks not only accountability for past crimes but also improvement in the way future investigations are conducted. The Lake Waco murders remain a solemn reminder of that enduring obligation, ensuring that the memories of Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice continue to inspire careful reflection on the pursuit of truth, the demands of justice, and the lasting human cost of violent crime. Looking back across the decades, the Lake Waco murders occupy an unusual position in the history of American criminal justice. Some cases become remembered because they changed investigative techniques. Others are recalled because they exposed weaknesses in forensic science or prompted legal reform. The Lake Waco case is discussed for all of those reasons simultaneously. It is remembered as a devastating crime that claimed the lives of 3 young people, as a complex investigation that relied upon both physical evidence and participant testimony, and as a legal case that continues to encourage discussion about the standards by which guilt is established in court. Its significance therefore extends beyond the events of July 1982. It has become part of a broader conversation about how justice systems balance certainty with fairness, how scientific knowledge evolves over time, and how society remembers victims long after public attention has faded. One of the most important themes emerging from the case is the distinction between certainty and confidence. Criminal courts do not attempt to answer every historical question with absolute certainty. Instead, juries are asked to determine whether the prosecution has proved its case beyond a reasonable doubt according to the evidence presented. This legal standard recognizes that human events are often imperfectly documented. Witnesses remember different details, physical evidence may be incomplete, and investigators must reconstruct past events using whatever reliable information is available. In the Lake Waco murders, prosecutors argued that the combined weight of witness testimony, forensic findings, and investigative work satisfied that standard. The jury agreed, leading to convictions and sentences that remained in effect through subsequent legal review. Yet the continuing public discussion demonstrates that legal conclusions and historical inquiry are not identical. Historians, journalists, and researchers frequently revisit important cases, asking new questions as additional information, scientific developments, or changing investigative standards become available. This process does not necessarily undermine judicial decisions. Rather, it reflects society's ongoing commitment to understanding significant events as accurately as possible. The evolution of forensic science illustrates this principle particularly well. Techniques once considered persuasive have, in some instances, been reassessed as research has advanced. At the same time, entirely new technologies, especially DNA analysis, have transformed criminal investigations in ways that investigators in 1982 could scarcely have imagined. Although DNA profiling did not play the role in this case that it would in later decades, the broader development of forensic science has encouraged experts to examine historical investigations with fresh perspectives. Such reassessments are not admissions of failure. Instead, they demonstrate that science strengthens itself through continual testing, refinement, and willingness to question previous assumptions. The legal profession has undergone similar development. Courts today often place increased emphasis on documenting interviews, preserving physical evidence, and carefully evaluating expert testimony before it reaches a jury. Many of these improvements grew out of lessons learned across numerous criminal cases throughout the United States. The Lake Waco investigation is frequently included in discussions illustrating why prosecutors must distinguish clearly between independently established facts and testimony provided by cooperating witnesses. Such testimony may be truthful and indispensable, but it also requires careful scrutiny because jurors deserve to understand the circumstances under which it was given. The adversarial system is designed precisely for that purpose. Prosecutors present their interpretation of the evidence, defense attorneys challenge it vigorously, and jurors decide which explanation is supported beyond a reasonable doubt. Although that process cannot eliminate every controversy, it provides a structured framework for evaluating competing claims according to established legal standards. Equally significant is the case's impact on public understanding of violent crime. High-profile cases often generate intense media attention during the investigation and trial. Yet public interest tends to diminish as years pass. The Lake Waco murders have proven different. Books, documentaries, legal analyses, and journalistic investigations have revisited the case repeatedly, not because new sensational details emerged, but because the underlying legal questions remained relevant. This continued attention has helped preserve the historical record while also encouraging critical examination of investigative practices. Responsible true crime scholarship serves an important function when it focuses on evidence, procedure, and the experiences of victims rather than sensationalizing offenders. By emphasizing documented facts and acknowledging areas of uncertainty, researchers contribute to a more accurate public understanding of both crime and justice. Throughout those discussions, the lives of Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice remain the foundation upon which every legal and historical debate ultimately rests. Before their names appeared in court records, investigative reports, or newspaper headlines, they were simply three young people enjoying the freedom of summer. Kenneth had recently graduated from high school and was beginning adulthood. Jill looked forward to opportunities that lay ahead after completing her education. Raylene was remembered as a devoted friend and family member whose quiet personality left a lasting impression on those who knew her. Their ambitions were ordinary, their relationships familiar, and their futures still unwritten. Remembering those realities is essential because criminal cases can sometimes become dominated by legal arguments or public controversy, obscuring the individuals whose lives were interrupted. The most meaningful measure of justice is not merely whether convictions are obtained, but whether the victims themselves remain at the center of the historical narrative. The families of the victims likewise deserve recognition. Long after media coverage declines and court proceedings conclude, relatives continue living with the consequences of violent crime. Anniversaries, birthdays, and family milestones become reminders of lives that ended too soon. While the legal system seeks accountability through investigation and prosecution, it cannot erase grief or restore lost opportunities. Understanding this human dimension is essential to any responsible examination of the case. Justice may provide answers, but it cannot replace the futures that were taken away. This reality explains why many families continue supporting improvements in investigative practices and victim services. Their experiences contribute to broader efforts aimed at preventing future tragedies while ensuring that victims receive dignity throughout the legal process. The Lake Waco murders also remind investigators and legal professionals that every major case leaves lessons extending beyond its immediate outcome. Detectives refine investigative procedures by studying earlier successes and mistakes. Prosecutors examine previous trials to strengthen future presentations of evidence. Defense attorneys analyze contested cases to improve legal safeguards protecting the rights of the accused. Forensic scientists evaluate historical investigations to identify opportunities for methodological improvement. Each profession contributes to a justice system that evolves continuously rather than remaining fixed in time. The willingness to learn from difficult cases represents one of the justice system's greatest strengths. Progress often emerges through careful reflection upon the challenges encountered in earlier investigations. More than 40 years after the crimes at Spiegelville Park, the Lake Waco murders continue to stand as one of Texas's most closely examined homicide cases. The legal judgments remain part of the official record, while scholarly discussion continues exploring the evidence, investigative methods, and broader implications of the case. These parallel realities illustrate that justice involves both resolution and reflection. Courts resolve individual criminal prosecutions according to law, while historians and researchers continue examining how those prosecutions fit within the larger development of criminal investigation and forensic science. Neither process diminishes the other. Together, they contribute to a deeper understanding of how societies pursue truth, administer justice, and preserve the memory of those whose lives were forever changed by violence. Ultimately, the enduring legacy of the Lake Waco murders is not found in the notoriety of the offenders or the complexity of the legal debates. It is found in the continuing commitment to remember Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice as individuals whose lives mattered long before they became part of a criminal investigation. Their story continues to remind investigators, legal professionals, scholars, and the public that every homicide case represents far more than evidence collected or verdicts announced. It represents families seeking answers, communities confronting loss, and a justice system striving, however imperfectly, to fulfill its responsibility to both the living and the dead. Through that perspective, the Lake Waco murders remain not only a significant historical case, but also a lasting reminder of the importance of accuracy, fairness, compassion, and the continual pursuit of truth within the rule of law. The passage of time has changed the way the Lake Waco murders are understood. In the immediate aftermath of the crime, the case was viewed primarily through the lens of shock, fear, and the urgent demand for justice. In the years that followed, however, the case became part of a larger discussion about how criminal investigations are conducted, how evidence is evaluated, and how the justice system responds when certainty is difficult to achieve. The story of Lake Waco is therefore not only a story about one investigation in Texas. It is also a reflection of broader challenges faced by law enforcement agencies, courts, and communities throughout the United States when confronting serious violent crimes. At the center of that discussion remains the responsibility to seek truth while recognizing the limitations of human institutions. Every investigation begins with uncertainty. Detectives rarely possess a complete picture of events when they first arrive at a crime scene. Instead, they must gradually assemble information from physical evidence, witness accounts, expert analysis, and careful reconstruction. The Lake Waco investigation demonstrated this reality clearly. When authorities first entered Spiegelville Park, they knew that 3 young people had been killed, but they did not know who was responsible or why the crime had occurred. There were no simple answers waiting to be discovered. The investigators' task was to transform scattered information into a coherent explanation that could withstand examination in court. This process required patience, discipline, and attention to detail. It also required recognizing that every piece of evidence has both value and limitations. Physical evidence can establish important facts, but it may not always explain every circumstance. Witness testimony can reveal information unavailable from other sources, but it must be evaluated carefully. The challenge for investigators and courts is not to find a single perfect piece of evidence, but to determine whether the combined information creates a reliable and convincing understanding of what occurred. The Lake Waco case remains frequently discussed because it demonstrates the complexity of this process. The investigation relied heavily on statements from individuals connected to the events, particularly Anthony Melendez, whose cooperation became a central part of the prosecution's case. His testimony allowed authorities to reconstruct events that otherwise would have been extremely difficult to understand. At the same time, his position as a participant created questions that defense attorneys and later commentators considered significant. These competing perspectives represent a fundamental challenge in criminal justice. Information from involved individuals may be necessary, but it must always be examined with careful attention to motivation, consistency, and independent confirmation. This issue extends far beyond the Lake Waco case. Throughout criminal history, cooperating witnesses have played important roles in solving crimes, particularly when offenses occur in private locations without outside observers. Organized crime investigations, conspiracy cases, and many homicide investigations have depended upon insiders who provide information about events hidden from the public. Yet legal systems have also recognized the potential dangers of relying too heavily on such testimony. The credibility of every witness must be evaluated individually, and jurors must consider not only what a person says, but also the circumstances surrounding that person's statement. The Lake Waco proceedings became part of this larger conversation about balancing the practical realities of investigation with the need for fairness and reliability. Another lasting lesson from the case concerns the importance of preserving and evaluating evidence. According to changing scientific standards, criminal investigations do not occur outside history. They take place within a specific period, using the knowledge and technology available at that time. Methods considered reliable in one generation may later be refined, questioned, or replaced as scientific understanding improves. This evolution is not unusual. Medicine, engineering, technology, and countless other fields experience similar changes. Forensic science is no different. The later criticism of bite mark analysis, which had once been accepted in many courtrooms, became part of a broader reassessment of forensic practices across the United States. The lesson is not that previous investigators acted without effort or professionalism. Rather, it is that justice systems must remain open to improvement as knowledge advances. A method can be accepted in good faith at one point in history and later require reevaluation when stronger scientific research becomes available. This willingness to change is essential for maintaining public confidence. Public perception of criminal cases is often shaped by media coverage, especially during moments of intense attention. The Lake Waco murders received substantial publicity because of the severity of the crime and the emotional impact on the community. Media attention can serve valuable purposes by informing the public and encouraging accountability. But it can also create challenges. High-profile cases may become influenced by public expectations before all evidence has been fully examined. Investigators must therefore work carefully to separate public pressure from investigative judgment. Prosecutors must present cases based on evidence rather than emotion. Courts must remain focused on legal standards rather than public opinion. The Lake Waco case illustrates why these principles are so important. Serious crimes naturally create strong emotional responses. But the justice system requires a process designed to evaluate facts objectively. The continuing discussion surrounding the case also highlights the difference between questioning a case and rejecting the entire justice process. Reviewing historical cases is not necessarily an argument that conclusions were wrong. Instead, review can help identify what was done correctly, what could be improved, and what lessons may benefit future investigations. Societies learn by examining difficult moments. The willingness to analyze past cases demonstrates a commitment to improving the systems responsible for protecting communities and determining accountability. For the families of Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice, the passage of time has not diminished the significance of their loss. While public discussion often focuses on evidence, trials, and legal debates, families experience these events in deeply personal ways. They remember birthdays, conversations, personalities, and dreams that existed before the tragedy. They live with the absence left behind by the victims. Any historical examination of the Lake Waco murders must therefore begin and end with recognition of the human lives behind the case file. The victims were not simply names in investigative documents. They were young people with relationships, ambitions, and futures that mattered. Their memories remain the most important part of the story. The broader impact of the case can also be seen in the way communities respond after acts of violence. Major crimes often force communities to reconsider their sense of safety and trust. Places once associated with ordinary activities may become connected with painful memories. Residents may seek reassurance from authorities, demand improvements in public safety, or support victims' families through difficult periods. These responses reflect a community's attempt to process tragedy and move forward while preserving the memory of those lost. The Lake Waco murders became part of Waco's history not because the community wanted such recognition, but because the events left an undeniable mark on local memory. In the decades since 1982, the case has remained relevant because it raises questions that extend beyond one location or one group of individuals. How should investigators evaluate conflicting information? How should courts assess testimony from participants? How should forensic evidence be handled when scientific understanding changes? How can society remember victims while also examining legal processes critically? These questions do not have simple answers, but they are essential questions for any justice system seeking improvement. The legacy of the Lake Waco murders lies partly in the fact that they continue to encourage thoughtful examination of these issues. Ultimately, the pursuit of justice is an ongoing responsibility. Investigators must continue searching for facts. Courts must continue protecting fairness. Scientists must continue testing and improving methods of evidence analysis. Communities must continue supporting victims and their families. The Lake Waco case represents a painful chapter in Texas history, but it also represents an opportunity to understand how justice develops through experience, reflection, and accountability. The memory of Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice endures not because of the crime committed against them, but because their lives continue to remind society of the importance of truth, compassion, and a justice system committed to serving both victims and the pursuit of fairness. As the decades passed after the Lake Waco murders, the case gradually moved from an active criminal investigation into a subject of historical examination. The urgency that had defined the early investigation and the courtroom battles eventually gave way to a different kind of attention. Instead of detectives searching for answers and prosecutors seeking convictions, journalists, legal researchers, and forensic specialists began examining the case as an example of how the criminal justice system operates under difficult circumstances. The questions surrounding Lake Waco were no longer limited to who was responsible for the crimes. They expanded into broader discussions about evidence, reliability, accountability, and the ways in which society remembers violent events long after the courtroom proceedings have ended. In many ways, the continued attention surrounding the case demonstrates how certain criminal investigations become part of a nation's larger legal history. Some cases disappear from public awareness after convictions are reached. Others remain because they raise questions that continue to matter beyond the individuals directly involved. The Lake Waco murders belong to the second category. The brutality of the crime ensured that it would be remembered, but the continuing debate over evidence and procedure gave the case an additional significance. It became a reference point in conversations about the responsibilities of investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and forensic experts. One of the most important aspects of the case's later history was the examination of whether the original investigation had adequately addressed every possible question. This type of review is common in major criminal cases, particularly those involving severe penalties. Death penalty cases receive especially intense scrutiny because the consequences of error are permanent. Appellate courts, defense teams, and independent reviewers examine trial records, evidence, and legal procedures to determine whether constitutional and procedural requirements were properly followed. In David Spence's case, the legal system repeatedly reviewed challenges brought forward by his defense team. Those reviews considered arguments concerning the trial and evidence, but the conviction remained in place until his execution in 1997. The conclusion of the legal process, however, did not eliminate historical interest. For many observers, the question was not simply whether the courts had reached a final decision, but how future generations should understand the evidence that led to that decision. This distinction between legal finality and historical discussion is important. Courts must make decisions based on specific legal standards and the evidence available during proceedings. Historical researchers operate differently. They examine cases with the benefit of time, additional context, and developments in scientific understanding. Their role is not to replace the courts, but to analyze how decisions were made and what lessons can be learned. In the Lake Waco case, this process led researchers to focus on several major issues, particularly the role of cooperating witnesses and the changing standards of forensic science. The reliance on Anthony Melendez's testimony remained one of the most frequently discussed elements of the prosecution. His cooperation was viewed by prosecutors as essential because it provided investigators with a detailed account of events that occurred away from public view. Without such testimony, reconstructing the night of July 13, 1982 would have been significantly more difficult. However, the same factor that made his testimony valuable also created questions. Because Anthony was involved in the events under investigation, critics argued that his statements required especially careful evaluation. The possibility that a cooperating witness might seek personal benefit is a concern recognized. Throughout criminal justice, courts therefore rely on cross-examination, corroborating evidence, and careful jury instructions to address these challenges. The Lake Waco case became one example of the broader debate about how much weight should be given to testimony from individuals who are not neutral observers. Another issue that continued to shape discussion was the development of forensic science after the original trial. In 1982, investigators worked within the accepted scientific framework of that era. Over time, however, forensic disciplines across the United States underwent significant review. Techniques once widely accepted came under greater scientific examination, and courts increasingly demanded stronger validation for expert evidence. The controversy surrounding bite mark analysis became part of this larger movement. Researchers questioned whether the method could reliably identify individuals and whether conclusions based on such evidence were sufficiently supported by scientific research. The Lake Waco case was later mentioned in discussions about these changes because bite mark evidence had been part of the original proceedings. The broader lesson was not limited to one case. It reflected a fundamental principle of justice. Evidence must always be evaluated according to the strongest available understanding of science. The case also demonstrated the importance of separating public speculation from verified information. Because of the enormous attention surrounding the murders, various theories emerged over the years. Among them were suggestions involving Henry Lee Lucas, whose false confessions to numerous crimes created confusion in many investigations across the country. His name became connected with multiple cases, including Lake Waco, but no evidence sufficient to change the established outcome was found. The situation illustrated the difficulties created when notorious figures become associated with unresolved or controversial cases. Public fascination can generate new questions, but investigators must rely on evidence rather than reputation or assumption. The search for truth requires both openness to possibilities and discipline in evaluating claims. The passage of time also changed how the victims were remembered. During the original investigation and trial, public attention often focused on the accused, the evidence, and the courtroom conflict. Years later, many discussions returned to the lives of Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice. This shift was important because it restored attention to the people whose lives had been taken. True crime discussions can sometimes become dominated by offenders and investigative details, but responsible examination of criminal cases must keep victims at the center. Kenneth, Jill, and Raylene were not defined by the circumstances of their deaths. They were young people with families, friendships, and futures that were interrupted. Their memory represents the human reality behind the legal documents and historical debates. The families of the victims also carried the lasting impact of the case. While the criminal justice system concluded its proceedings, personal grief does not follow a courtroom schedule. Families often continue experiencing loss long after verdicts are announced and media coverage disappears. The pursuit of justice can provide accountability, but it cannot restore what was taken. This reality is one of the most important reminders in examining any violent crime. Legal outcomes matter, but they exist within a much larger human context. Communities affected by tragedy must continue finding ways to remember victims while supporting those left behind. The Lake Waco murders remain significant because they represent multiple dimensions of justice at once. They are a story of violent crime, but also a story of investigation, prosecution, scientific development, and historical reflection. They demonstrate the dedication required to solve difficult cases while also showing why evidence must always be examined critically. They reveal both the strengths and limitations of legal systems created by human beings working with imperfect information. More than 40 years later, the case continues to encourage discussion because the questions it raises remain relevant. How can investigators achieve accuracy when evidence is limited? How can courts balance the need for convictions with the need to protect against error? How should society respond when scientific knowledge changes? These questions extend far beyond Lake Waco. They are fundamental questions faced by every justice system. The lasting legacy of the case is therefore not only found in the verdicts or the names of those convicted. It exists in the continuing effort to understand how justice is pursued, how mistakes can be prevented, and how victims can be remembered with dignity. The story of the Lake Waco murders remains a reminder that every criminal investigation represents more than a search for offenders. It represents a search for truth, a responsibility to victims, and an ongoing commitment to fairness. The Lake Waco murders remain one of the most complex and debated criminal cases in Texas history because they exist at the intersection of two powerful realities. The first is the undeniable tragedy of 3 young lives lost in an act of extreme violence. The second is the continuing examination of how the justice system responded to that tragedy. For many people, the case represents the successful investigation and prosecution of individuals believed responsible for a horrific crime. For others, it represents an opportunity to examine the difficulties that arise when a conviction depends heavily on witness testimony, evolving forensic methods, and legal interpretations that may be reconsidered over time. Understanding the case requires acknowledging both aspects. The victims deserve recognition and justice, while the process used to determine responsibility must always remain open to careful examination. This balance is one of the most important principles in any criminal justice system. The purpose of reviewing old cases is not simply to criticize past decisions or defend them without question. Instead, review allows society to understand how justice functions, where it succeeds, and where improvements may be necessary. The Lake Waco investigation provides a valuable example because it involved many of the challenges commonly found in difficult homicide cases. Investigators were confronted with a crime scene that revealed a violent attack, but did not immediately identify those responsible. They had to reconstruct events that occurred in an isolated location with no independent eyewitnesses who could describe the entire sequence. The eventual prosecution depended on combining physical evidence with testimony from individuals connected to the crime. This type of investigation requires careful judgment because every source of information carries both strengths and limitations. The testimony of Anthony Melendez remained one of the most important elements of the case. According to prosecutors, his cooperation allowed investigators to understand the sequence of events and identify the roles of those involved. His account provided details that helped connect suspects to the crime and supported the state's argument that David Spence was the primary aggressor. However, because Anthony was not an uninvolved observer, his testimony naturally became a subject of intense examination. Defense attorneys questioned his credibility and emphasized that he had his own involvement in the events. This disagreement represented a fundamental question within criminal law. How should courts evaluate information provided by someone who may have personal reasons for cooperating? There is no simple answer. In some cases, such testimony reveals the truth about crimes that might otherwise remain unsolved. In other cases, unreliable testimony can contribute to wrongful convictions. The responsibility of the justice system is to evaluate each situation carefully and consider whether the testimony is supported by other evidence. The Lake Waco proceedings reflected this challenge. Jurors were required to consider the entire body of evidence rather than any single statement or piece of information. They heard arguments from both prosecutors and defense attorneys, evaluated witnesses, and ultimately reached their decisions based on the legal standard presented to them. Another major issue associated with the case is the changing understanding of forensic evidence. Modern discussions about criminal investigations often focus on the importance of scientific reliability. Forensic methods can be powerful tools, but their value depends on the strength of the science behind them. Over the years, several forensic techniques, once accepted in courtrooms, have undergone significant reassessment. Bite mark analysis became one of the most prominent examples of this shift. During earlier decades, many courts accepted bite mark comparisons as evidence that could help identify suspects. Later research raised concerns about whether such conclusions were scientifically dependable. The broader lesson from this development is that forensic science must constantly evaluate itself. A method should not be protected simply because it has been used in previous cases. Instead, it must continue to meet standards of testing, reliability, and accuracy. This principle benefits everyone involved in the justice system, including victims seeking accountability and defendants seeking fair treatment. The debate surrounding the Lake Waco murders also highlights the importance of distinguishing between legal conclusions and unanswered historical questions. A court verdict represents a formal decision reached through a specific legal process. Historical analysis operates differently. Researchers may examine additional context, compare changing scientific standards, or explore questions that were not central to the original trial. These different approaches do not necessarily conflict. A conviction can remain legally valid while still being studied critically by historians and legal experts. In fact, such examination is an essential part of a healthy justice system because it encourages transparency and improvement. The discussion of Henry Lee Lucas provides another example of why evidence must always be separated from speculation. Lucas became associated with numerous crimes because of his extensive false confessions, many of which were later shown to be unreliable. His name attracted attention in connection with various investigations, including Lake Waco. However, no evidence sufficient to alter the established conclusions of the case emerged. This demonstrates the importance of maintaining investigative discipline. A theory may attract public interest, but only evidence can change the understanding of a criminal case. Investigators must remain willing to explore possibilities while also requiring proof before accepting conclusions. The same principle applies to the broader public conversation surrounding the Lake Waco murders. Emotional reactions are understandable, especially in cases involving young victims and extreme violence. Communities naturally seek answers and accountability. However, justice requires more than emotional certainty. It requires procedures designed to evaluate facts carefully and fairly. This can be difficult because victims' families, investigators, prosecutors, and the public often experience intense pressure for resolution. Yet the integrity of the justice system depends on maintaining standards even under the most challenging circumstances. The memory of Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice remains the central reason the case continues to matter. Their lives existed before the investigation, before the trials, and before the public debate. They were young people with families who loved them, friendships they valued, and futures they had not yet experienced. The tragedy of their deaths should not be reduced only to questions about evidence and legal procedure. Those issues matter because they affect how society responds to victims, but the victims themselves must always remain the focus. Remembering them requires recognizing the full humanity that existed before the crime. Their story represents not only a criminal investigation, but also a reminder of the profound consequences of violence. The case also demonstrates how communities carry the memory of tragedy. Waco and the surrounding area experienced fear and grief following the murders, and the case became permanently connected with local history. Over time, communities often transform painful memories into opportunities for reflection. They examine how tragedies occurred, how authorities responded, and what lessons can be carried forward. This process does not erase the past, but it allows society to learn from it. In this sense, the Lake Waco murders continue to influence discussions about criminal justice because they represent both a tragedy and a lesson. They show why investigators must be thorough, why courts must be careful, and why evidence must always be examined honestly. The pursuit of justice is not a simple path from crime to conviction. It is a complex process involving human judgment, scientific methods, legal safeguards, and moral responsibility. The history of the Lake Waco murders demonstrates that even after a case reaches its official conclusion, questions about justice, evidence, and memory can continue for generations. That ongoing discussion is not a sign that the case has been forgotten. Instead, It reflects the importance of ensuring that every major criminal case contributes to a deeper understanding of how justice can be pursued more accurately and fairly in the future. More than 40 years after the events at Spiegelville Park, the Lake Waco murders remain a case remembered not only for the tragedy that occurred, but also for the questions that continued long after the courtroom doors closed. The murders of Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice left an irreversible mark on their families, their community, and the history of criminal justice in Texas. The official legal process reached its conclusion with convictions and sentences, yet the case continued to exist in another form, as a subject of examination, discussion, and reflection. It became a reminder that some criminal cases are never limited to the moment when a verdict is announced. Their influence continues through the lessons they provide about investigation, evidence, accountability, and the difficult responsibility of seeking truth. At the heart of the Lake Waco story are three young people whose lives ended far too soon. Kenneth, Jill, and Raylene were not public figures. They were ordinary teenagers experiencing a normal summer evening, unaware that their lives would become connected to one of the most discussed homicide cases in Texas history. Kenneth Lamar Franks was only 18 years old. He was remembered by those who knew him as a young man entering adulthood, someone with relationships, responsibilities, and hopes for the future. Jill Montgomery, 17, was described as energetic and full of life, with plans and possibilities ahead of her. Raylene Liddell Rice, also 17, was remembered as a close friend and valued member of her family. Their identities should not be overshadowed by the circumstances of their deaths. Before they became names in police reports and courtroom records, they were individuals with dreams, personalities, and people who cared deeply about them. The tragedy of the Lake Waco murders is ultimately measured by what was lost: three futures that would never unfold. The criminal investigation that followed their deaths became a difficult examination of how authorities respond when confronted with a crime of extreme violence and limited initial information. Investigators were required to reconstruct events that had taken place in an isolated area, relying on the evidence available and the statements of those connected to the incident. Their work eventually led to arrests, prosecutions, and convictions. The legal system determined that David Wayne Spence was responsible as the central figure in the crime and sentenced him to death. Gilbert Melendez received a sentence of life imprisonment. Anthony Melendez received reduced punishment after cooperating with investigators, while Perry Surita was not convicted of murder due to the determination that the evidence did not establish the same level of direct involvement attributed to the others. These outcomes became the official resolution of the case, but they also became the foundation for later debate about how those conclusions were reached. The most significant discussions surrounding the case have focused on the nature of evidence and the challenges of establishing the truth in complicated investigations. The Lake Waco murders demonstrate that criminal justice often operates in circumstances where perfect evidence does not exist. Investigators must work with available information, and courts must determine whether that information meets the legal standards required for conviction. This process is designed to balance two essential goals: holding responsible individuals accountable while protecting against unjust conclusions. Achieving both objectives is one of the greatest challenges faced by any justice system. The case continues to be studied because it highlights this balance so clearly. The role of cooperating witnesses remains one of the most important lessons from the investigation. Anthony Melendez's testimony provided prosecutors with a detailed account of events that occurred away from public view. Without such cooperation, investigators may have faced significant difficulties reconstructing what happened. At the same time, his position as someone involved in the events created questions that became part of later discussions. The case illustrates why testimony from cooperating individuals must always be examined carefully. Such witnesses can provide essential information, but courts must also consider their circumstances, motivations, and whether their statements are supported by independent evidence. This principle remains relevant in criminal investigations throughout the United States. Another lasting lesson from the Lake Waco case involves the evolution of forensic science. The understanding of evidence is not static. Methods accepted in one period may later be reconsidered as scientific knowledge develops. The controversy surrounding bite mark evidence became part of a larger national conversation about the reliability of certain forensic techniques. This evolution demonstrates the importance of allowing science to question itself. Progress occurs when researchers test established ideas, identify weaknesses, and develop better approaches. The justice system depends upon this process because evidence used in court must reflect the strongest available understanding of reality. The examination of older cases, including Lake Waco, contributes to that ongoing improvement. The case also demonstrates why historical review remains important even after legal proceedings are complete. Reviewing a criminal case does not necessarily mean rejecting the outcome. Instead, it allows society to understand how decisions were made and what lessons can be applied in the future. Legal conclusions are reached within specific courtroom circumstances, while historical analysis considers broader developments over time. Both perspectives contribute to a more complete understanding of justice. A society that examines its past is better prepared to improve its future. The continued interest in the Lake Waco murders reflects this desire to understand, learn, and remember. The case has also shown the importance of separating evidence from speculation. Because of the attention surrounding the murders, various theories emerged over the years, including speculation involving Henry Lee Lucas. However, investigations require more than possibilities. They require verified information capable of supporting conclusions. The absence of sufficient evidence connecting Lucas to the case demonstrates the importance of maintaining discipline when evaluating claims. Public curiosity may generate questions, but only reliable evidence can provide answers. Perhaps the most enduring message of the Lake Waco murders is that justice is ultimately about people. Legal procedures, forensic methods, and investigative strategies are essential, but they exist because real lives are affected by crime. The victims' families experienced a loss that no verdict could reverse. The community experienced fear and grief that could not simply disappear after the trial ended. The individuals involved in the investigation carried the responsibility of seeking answers in a case where the stakes were extraordinarily high. Every part of the justice process was connected to human consequences. Remembering this human dimension prevents criminal cases from becoming only debates about evidence or legal strategy. Today, the Lake Waco murders remain a significant chapter in Texas criminal history because they represent both the need for justice and the need for continual reflection. The convictions remain part of the official record, while discussions about evidence, forensic science, and legal procedures continue among researchers and observers. These two realities can exist together. A case can have a legal conclusion while still providing important lessons for future generations. The pursuit of justice does not end with a verdict. It continues through the effort to understand, improve, and remember. The story of Kenneth Lamar Franks, Jill Montgomery, and Raylene Liddell Rice remains a solemn reminder of the responsibility carried by investigators, courts, and society as a whole. Their lives were taken in an act of violence, but their memory continues through the lessons drawn from their case. The Lake Waco murders are not remembered only because of the crime that occurred, but because they continue to raise important questions about truth, fairness, and the search for justice. In the end, the greatest legacy of the case is not the attention given to those accused or the controversy surrounding the investigation. It is the recognition that behind every criminal file are real people whose lives mattered, whose stories deserve to be remembered, and whose pursuit of justice represents one of the most important responsibilities of a society governed by law.